Andres Escobar. He scored on his own team. 11 days later, he was dead. And the men who killed him wanted him to know exactly why, shouting a single word with every bullet they fired. Andres Escobar was one of the most composed defenders in the world, a player famous for calm, disciplined decision-making under pressure, the kind of player commentators pointed to as the calm center of a talented, chaotic team.
That composure is what makes what happened next so strange. In the 1994 World Cup, chasing back a low, harmless-looking cross, Escobar stretched out his leg to intercept it before it reached an American striker. He deflected it past his own goalkeeper. Colombia, one of the tournament favorites, a team many experts had picked to go deep into the knockout rounds, was eliminated days later.
What most fans watching at home didn't know was that enormous sums of money tied to men who did not lose quietly and who had reportedly threatened players before the tournament even began had been riding on Colombia's run. 10 days after he flew home to Medellin, against the advice of people close to him who worried it wasn't safe yet, Escobar was in a parking lot outside a bar when a car pulled up beside him.
Witnesses say the men inside argued with him for several minutes before drawing their weapons. He was shot 6 times. According to multiple witnesses at the scene, the shooter yelled, "Goal! Goal!" with every single trigger pull, turning the killing into a grotesque replay of the mistake that had brought him there. One man eventually served a reduced sentence for firing the shots, walking free years later.
But who actually gave the order and why the argument escalated into an execution instead of ending with words has never been fully answered, and Colombian authorities have never closed the case with a complete explanation. Ayrton Senna. Here's a sport where the danger is never a surprise. Every driver knows the risk before the engine even starts, has made peace with it in some private way just to be able to strap in.
But nobody expected it to end this way. For this driver specifically, on a weekend that had already gone wrong before his race even began. Ayrton Senna was widely considered the most gifted driver of his generation, seemingly immune to the thing that eventually catches up with everyone who sits in that seat long enough.
The day before his final race, he'd watched a fellow driver crash so violently in qualifying that it put him in a coma, and Senna, visibly shaken by what he'd seen, raced again anyway less than 24 hours later. On lap 7 of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, his car failed to take a corner it had taken cleanly hundreds of times before, at speed, in practice, and in races, and struck a concrete wall at roughly 145 miles an hour.
From the broadcast booth, it didn't even look catastrophic. The car came to rest almost gently, nose crumpled, and for a moment, commentators assumed he'd walk away. What the cameras couldn't show was that a piece of the front suspension had snapped on impact and driven straight through the front of his helmet. He was still alive when the medical crew reached him, and for a brief window there was hope. He would not survive the hour.
His death, watched live by tens of millions of people across the world, forced Formula One to tear apart and rebuild its entire safety architecture from scratch. Cockpits, barriers, helmets, runoff areas, nearly all of it changed because of what happened on that single corner on that single lap. Boxing had killed men before. Quietly, off camera, in small clubs, in results that never made it past the local paper. This time, the entire country was watching live on network television on a Friday night the way millions of American households did every week. In 1962, Emil Griffith and Benny Paret met for a third time, a rivalry that had turned deeply personal after Paret publicly insulted Griffith at the weigh-in days before the fight, using a slur aimed at his sexuality in front of reporters and cameras.
Griffith, by most accounts, carried that insult with him into the ring. By the 12th round, he had Paret trapped against the ropes, and what followed stopped resembling a boxing match entirely. 29 punches landed in rapid, uninterrupted succession, and Paret couldn't fall because the ropes were the only thing still holding his body upright. The referee, watching from close range, waited longer than he should have to step in and stop it. Paret slipped into a coma right there in the ring, in front of the cameras, and never spoke another word. He died 10 days later without waking. Because the fight had aired on national television, watched live by an audience that had no idea they were about to witness a man's final moments, the fallout was immediate and public. Lawmakers, doctors, and millions of ordinary viewers suddenly asking, out loud and on the record, whether boxing should be allowed to exist at all. Football, the American kind, hits harder than almost any sport played on grass. Full-speed collisions every single play for 60 minutes. Players trained from childhood to absorb impact after impact. And yet, in the entire history of the NFL, spanning more than a century of exactly that kind of violence, only one player has ever died on the field during an actual game. It wasn't a hit that did it. In 1971, Detroit Lions receiver Chuck Hughes was simply jogging back to the huddle after an unremarkable play. Nothing unusual happening around him, no collision, no big hit, when he suddenly dropped to the turf. For several long seconds, nobody reacted. Players nearby assumed he was just catching his breath, maybe cramping, the way players occasionally do mid-game. He wasn't. He was having a massive heart attack, the result of severe coronary artery disease that had gone completely undiagnosed, invisible to every physical and screening he'd passed to that point in his career. By the time medical staff on the sideline realized what was actually happening and reached him, it was already too late. He was pronounced dead before he ever left the stadium, the only death of its kind the league has ever recorded, in a sport built almost entirely around the idea that the danger comes from the hits. Cycling has always demanded suffering as the entry fee for victory. Riders push their bodies past what seems reasonable, and for over a century, that's usually just been called toughness, the sport romanticizing exactly the kind of self-destruction that should have alarmed anyone watching closely. In 1967, on the brutal, shadeless slopes of Mount Ventoux, a mountain rider still called the Giant for how it breaks people, one rider decided to pay with more than his body could actually survive. Tom Simpson had a well-known habit among his peers of ignoring his own limits entirely, and this stage, under blistering heat, with barely any shade for miles, was no exception. Partway up the mountain, spectators lining the road noticed him riding in a jagged, unsteady line, weaving in a way that should have been an obvious signal to stop. Then he fell. In a moment that's been replayed and picked apart for decades since, witnesses say he refused to stay down, insisting on getting back on the bike instead of accepting the race was over for him. Within minutes, he collapsed a second time. This time, he didn't get back up. The autopsy revealed the real story hiding underneath the exhaustion and the heat, a mix of amphetamines and alcohol in his system, a combination that had let his mind push straight through every warning signal his body had been sending him for miles. Hockey players take 100-mile-an-hour slap shots to the body and skate away fine more often than you'd expect, the padding built to absorb exactly that kind of impact.
Bill Masterton didn't die from a puck at all. During a 1968 game, an opponent checked him hard mid-play, a clean hit by the standards of the era. He lost his balance and fell straight backward, and the bare back of his head struck the ice with nothing at all to cushion it. Helmets weren't mandatory at the time, considered optional gear that most players, including Masterton, chose to skip for comfort and visibility. He never regained consciousness and died 2 days later in the hospital, the only player in NHL history to die as a direct result of an injury sustained on the ice, a fact that still surprises people who assume hockey's deadliest moments come from fights or high sticks. It would still be more than a decade after his death before the league finally required every incoming player to wear a helmet, a rule that came too late to help the man whose death made the case for it. Bruce Lee didn't die in a fight. He didn't die from an injury either. He died in an apartment in Hong Kong, lying down for what he thought would be a short rest after complaining of a headache and taking a common painkiller offered to him by someone else in the room. And even now, more than 50 years later, people still argue over what actually killed him. The official cause was cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain, ruled a rare allergic reaction to an ingredient in the medication he'd taken. But there was a detail the official ruling glossed over, one that rarely makes it into the headline version of the story. Lee had collapsed once before, months earlier, under almost identical circumstances, headache, then sudden collapse, and had survived that first time. Some who worked closely with him believed his body had simply been pushed past what it could recover from, citing brutal training regimens that bordered on self-punishment, extreme dieting to stay camera-ready, and, according to some accounts, past drug use, all cited as possible contributing factors that never made it into the official paperwork. The ruling itself calls it death by misadventure, a strangely vague phrase for a man whose death is still unofficially one of the most debated in the history of sports and entertainment combined. Cricket doesn't look dangerous from the outside. No pads on the head beyond a single helmet, no violent collisions like you'd see in contact sports. Just a hard ball delivered at speed from 22 yards away, over and over, for hours. But in 2014, that ball found the one small place a standard helmet at the time didn't fully protect.
Phillip Hughes, one of Australia's most promising young batsmen, a player teammates described as destined for the national team for years to come, was facing a bouncer, a short, aggressive delivery aimed at chest or head height meant to intimidate, when he turned his head away at exactly the wrong moment, trying to duck under it the way batsmen do dozens of times a match without incident.
The ball struck him just below the base of his skull, an area his helmet left exposed by design, traveling close to 90 miles an hour on impact. He collapsed on the pitch almost instantly, in front of teammates who initially thought he'd simply lost his footing or slipped, laughing it off for a second before realizing something was seriously wrong.
Despite emergency surgery within hours, he never regained consciousness, dying 2 days later at just 25 years old, days before he was expected to be named to the national squad. His death led cricket boards around the world to redesign helmets within months, adding protective padding to the exact spot where the ball had struck him, a change that came only after it was already too late for the player it was designed to protect.
And then there's the death that quietly rewrote a rule baseball still follows today in every single game, whether fans in the stands realize where it actually came from or not. In 1920, Cleveland shortstop Ray Chapman stepped up against a pitcher with a well-known habit around the league of scuffing and darkening the baseball deliberately so hitters could barely track it against the gray, hazy stadium backdrop behind the mound. Chapman, known even among his own teammates for crowding the plate closer than most hitters dared, a habit that had worked in his favor for years, never moved out of the way of the incoming pitch. The ball struck him directly in the head with a crack so loud that the pitcher from 60 feet away assumed it had hit the bat instead and fielded the ball as if the play were still live, only realizing something was wrong when he saw Chapman on the ground. Chapman collapsed, was helped to his feet by teammates, tried to walk toward the clubhouse under his own power, insisting he was fine, and collapsed again before he made it off the field. He died the next morning during emergency surgery. He remains, to this day, over a century later, the only player in Major League Baseball history to die from an injury sustained during a game, and the direct reason umpires now swap out the baseball the moment it gets scuffed, dirty, or discolored, instead of leaving a single ball in play for as long as the league always had before his death forced the rule to change.